What is going on, everybody? I just got through a very big reading project that for me was something I found to be quite the challenge. I both loved and enjoyed doing this reading project, and I also felt like I had to endure it. Um, let's get into it, guys. Alright, guys, so you've seen the picture, you've read the headlines, you know what it is. I finally finished Jack Kirby's Fourth World magnum opus. The biggest single story I've ever read in my entire life, which will be supplanted once I finish Sandman Volume 2. That will be the longest story I've ever read. But it's a massive omnibus going over 1,400 pages. In fact, 1,466 pages to be exact. Kirby had a cover or a story on. That's incredible to think about. Kirby, to me, and not to go too much into Kirby, I want this to be more about his story, Fourth World. Kirby is king to me because of his concepts. Nobody had a mind like Kirby. Just to think that Kirby basically created the Silver Age of comic books. He basically created he basically created the Marvel Universe alongside other guys, but Kirby did most of it. And then his output. Nobody can put out the issues. Kirby can. I mean, he was writing, towards the end of this, he was writing The Demon alongside Fourth World. He was writing somewhere in there, there's OMAC and Sandman and Kamandi. On top of the 4 issues a month he's doing in Fourth World. So it's just incredible to think about the output of Kirby sometimes. And I had a different experience in this than I had with, let's say, Neil Gaiman's magnus opus, Sandman. Or a fantastic, epic event by Grant Morrison from the 90s, DC 1 Million. It took me about 3 months to just devour 1 million. Granted, 1 million's a lot shorter than Fourth World. 1 million doesn't even crack 1,100 pages. And it's also a 90s event. Everything is pretty sequential, I guess you could say. I don't know if that's... It's pretty linear. I mean, you know where you're going. The direction is clear in 1 million. The direction is not so clear in Sandman, so my reading experience was different than this. You know, it took me about 6 months to read Sandman. But what makes Sandman so interesting and so great, what makes Neil Gaiman, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, so good, is Neil Gaiman is the king of tying the knot on a bow. He's the king of bringing forward his story. Those questions you didn't have answered from like issue 1, he'll bring them back and say issue 45 and tie the knot on the bow and conclude that part of his story. That is incredible that Neil Gaiman can do that. Kirby, his writing in his omnibus is far different than either Grant Morrison's, which again was a very linear, here's all the characters, here's snapshots of each character's journey, that's all heading towards the same point. You know, we're all heading towards the same climax. Here's your villain, and in the main arc, the main 1 million line, not the subsequential issues, we're all going to defeat Solaris and then celebrate at the end, right? It's kind of a simple story and premise, but I think that's one reason why it took me 3 months to just devour 1 million. Sandman was much heavier, obviously, if you know anything about Sandman. So I tried not to just devour it. I wanted to savor what I was reading. I wanted to fully digest and understand what I was reading. So it took me about 6 months to read Sandman. But this right here, I got Fourth World in December 2021, and I just finished it today, like literally 15 minutes before I started recording. I had finished the omnibus. So it took me a year and a half, almost to the day, to read Fourth World, and I both enjoyed this story, and I also feel like I had to endure the story. Where this story shines for me is, again, going back to Kirby's vision. Nobody has a mind like Kirby. I love the concept that Kirby came up with. You know, these two, and keep in mind, this was written in 1970. Star Wars does not come out for another 7 years. Another 8 years, roughly, give or take. I believe 1978 is the year A New Hope comes out. So there's no Star Wars for Kirby to take inspiration from. If anything, which I know I've heard the story, Lucas draws from a French comic for Star Wars. But if anything, maybe Lucas had read Fourth World. There are some themes in Fourth World that made me call back to Star Wars, which is interesting to note. And I know there's a miniseries, Deadpool Kills the Universe, that kind of explores the idea of all stories originate from like the same sort of storytelling from the ancient world. So I understand there's nothing new under the sun and that sort of thinking, and George Lucas was gonna, no matter what George Lucas did, you know, you could have said he was inspired by insert name of the story. But it is just interesting to note that I wouldn't be surprised to discover Lucas was inspired by Kirby and Fourth World. Because the concept is just so good and classic. And definitely the concept, the overall story of the new gods, Metron, Orion, Light Ray, Mr. Miracle, Big Barda, their fight against the forces of Apocalypse, you know, Darkseid, Kalibak, Desaad, Steppenwolf, Vermin Wunderbar, those sort of things, that is fantastic. But where this story is hard for me to read is in part because of the time it's written in, 1970. You know, the oldest story I had read to that point was Marv Wolfman's Omega Men. Omega Men 3 was the oldest comic book I'd ever read up to me getting into Fourth World. So that's really my context there. That's really my familiarity with older books is like 80s, really. I never really dived into Bronze Age comic books prior to this omnibus. And it really is a whole different world. It makes me wonder if I can handle Silver Age and Golden Age stories. I read All-Star Comics 3 somewhere in the middle of reading this because I just wanted to read the beginning of the universe, the DC universe. And it was just riddled with exposition, and it was just drowning in exposition. It was so hard to read and so uninteresting. And I don't know if older comics are for me. I think the Bronze Age is about all I can handle. The dialogue, the type of language used in here feels dated for sure. The Hunger Dogs graphic novel that is at the end of the Fourth World Omnibus. It's written in not quite Shakespearean, but it's just written in that fantasy epic language, like Lord of the Rings type of language. And that makes it harder to read and digest. And then also just the way comics were written back then, roughly, it seems like the Bronze Age and the Copper Age were where we were starting to get long form storytelling in comic books. I could be wrong. Put it in the comments if you know a really old long form story from the Golden or Silver Age. I'm sure they exist. But it just seems like it was becoming mainstream to long form storytell in the 70s and 80s. And this being one of them. But each individual issue, like for instance right here, each individual issue is 4 different separate stories. And that's kind of jarring. It makes the story feel incomplete. It doesn't help me to feel like the story is all headed towards one place. I think the first 50 issues of Todd McFarlane's Spawn and the Sandman, well, not necessarily the Sandman Omnibus, but like I want to say the first 50 issues of Spawn, I've read his first compendium. I think that is from what I've read, I don't want to make an absolute statement here, but it is the greatest story I've ever read of a writer's ability to take all these different plot threads and lead them all to a single point, a single climax. Make everything lead to one point. I think the first 50 issues of Spawn and what Todd McFarlane was able to do, those first 50 issues, did that for me. And so that's really my background, is like 1 Million and Sandman and Spawn, and I think I overhyped Fourth World in my head. I thought it was going to be just 100% about the forces of New Genesis and the New Gods fighting Apocalypse, and it wasn't that way. And there's so many threads that never got answered. What happened to, and I'll use some notes here. There's character notes in the back, and it's going to help me. It's going to help me to flesh out my thoughts. What happened to Black Racer? A very interesting character that Kirby created in New Gods issue 3, supposed to be an avatar of death. It's this usually an African American type of character, embodies the Black Racer persona or spirit or whatever. And in this story, it's Sergeant Willie Walker that personifies the spirit of death. And I thought he was a New God, and he's supposed to. He looks a little ridiculous. I'll just show the page. So there's Black Racer, and he flies on skis, and when he touches you, you're dead. Like, that's kind of the thing. He's kind of like the angel of death. And his story went nowhere. I don't know. I don't know what happened to Black Racer. I saw him for a couple of issues, and then he kind of disappeared. I don't know what happened to Dark Racer. Let's see here. Forager, another character, and I'll throw up the picture of Forager here. Forager. There's this sub-story about how the New Gods are wasteful of their food and their resources, and I don't even know what to call them. let's see here. The micro life is what they're described as. The micro life on New Genesis forages that food and those resources, and it creates a whole new subculture on New Genesis that the new gods treat them as subhuman, secondary class citizens. And they end up starting a battle with Mantis and, let's see if I can find Mantis and the lesser villains on Apocalypse. Here's Mantis. Yeah, the bug people on Apocalypse. So there's this whole sub battle, sub story. It's complex storytelling between the bug people and the micro life. But it goes nowhere. I don't know what happened to. I like to believe Mantis and the bug people come to Earth, and Orion and Light Ray and Forager stop them in the streets on Earth, and they retreat back to Apocalypse. But that's it. That's the last we see of the bug people. I don't know what happened to them. And then. And the way Kirby introduces all these characters is just, it's like he introduces them in a way, and a lot of this maybe has to do with the way he writes. It just seems like they appear. Like, snap the fingers, they're here, they always existed. Let's just hit the ground running. I don't really feel like I have time to comprehend the origin of a lot of these characters. One of the most excruciating things for me to read was the entire Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen series. I have no earthly idea why that book was even part of Fourth World. I mean, of course there are elements. The Newsboy Legion meet the furries, I believe. They're these scientists from New Genesis that are hiding from the forces of Apocalypse inside of a train. But that doesn't really seem to go anywhere, and that kind of leads into an arc where the Newsboy Legion are fighting these, they're called DNA aliens. They end up fighting all of these genetic soldiers. They're like GMO soldiers, if you will, clones almost, made by Makari, excuse me, some of these names are hard to pronounce. They're made by Makari, who looks like Goldust from the WWF in the 90s. But that kind of goes nowhere. I don't really, one issue, they get defeated, like bing, bang, boom, kind of 70s defeated. But, I don't get to see the bow tie. I don't get to see the aftermath of any of their battles. It's just like one beginning to end adventure, and then 2 weeks later, maybe we jump in time a little bit and we get to see the Newsboy Legion again. And it's like watching an episode of Scooby-Doo or something where it just time jumps too much. There's no linear storytelling there. There's no connecting one issue to the next issue. It's none of that. It feels like just isolated stories. And it's very jarring and it's hard to follow. And then I didn't find anything about Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen interesting at all. And because of behind the scenes things, Kirby came to DC to do what Kirby wanted to do. He didn't come to DC to work for DC, which is what DC had in mind. They wanted what Kirby did for the Marvel in the 60s. And DC. They wanted new characters, new marketed characters, more toys, more merchandise, blah, 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 blah. And Kirby never came to DC to do that. He came to DC to write Fourth World, his passion project, his magnum opus, the epic he always wanted to tell. That I think he may have wanted to try and tell in Silver Surfer, But drama over him not being included in Silver Surfer, that original volume. So the story goes. Kirby felt slighted at Lee for not being included in Silver Surfer, the character he created. Left for DC, or was the biggest issue why he left for DC. So DC having problems with Kirby that he's not creating all these great, magnificent characters. He's just putting out this epic that, according to some people, was very high concept and hard to read. I don't disagree with. I don't disagree with a lot of the fans that think that way, that Fourth World's hard to read, because it is. It's very hard to follow. And they canceled, that's where I'm going. I was trying to gather my thoughts. They canceled Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. I hate saying that book title. I hate it. I'm just going to call it Jimmy Olsen for the rest of this video. They canceled Jimmy Olsen at issue 148, and in that issue, they fight Victor Volcanum in a volcano. He's been sent there per instruction of Darkseid, and they defeat the Newsboy Legion, and Superman defeat Victor Volcanum in the volcano, blow up the volcano, and they ride back to Metropolis. They say, Metropolis, we're coming back. And that's literally it. There's nothing else. That book gets canceled. Superman and the Newsboy Legion are never seen again. We never see Superman and the Newsboy Legion interact with anybody from New Gods. We never see them interact with anybody in Mr. Miracle. We never see any connectivity with Apocalypse. The only real connectivity that book had with Fourth World at all was the fact that the Furies were in there. The fact that Makari was in there, an agent of Darkseid. I think they dealt with Gorgeous Godfrey, Beautiful Godfrey. He's like an evangelist of the Darkseid philosophy. And I believe they had a near run-in with Darkseid. And while I'm on this subject, while I've been bragging on the concept, some of the concepts are dumb and hard to follow. Like the Furies moving train, like the vehicle the Forever People drive in, it like changes shapes and stuff. Just 270s for me. And then one of the absolute worst issues, I felt like I lost intelligence points for reading it. Darkseid had set up a secret base that was inside of a carnival, like a county fair. And the Newsboy Legion went into this carnival to track down, I believe it was Godfrey. Godfrey was preaching the gospel of Darkseid in the carnival. The Newsboy Legion had to stop him. But, so there's interconnectivity there, but it wasn't connected to the rest of the books at all. It was self-contained, pretty much. And then none of it seemed to matter. Like, there were no callbacks to Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen towards the end of the book. It seemed like anytime the Newsboy Legion defeated an agent of Apocalypse, like, it didn't matter. There was just no referencing or anything to Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. And then, Forever People was part of the Slash. The DC canceled Forever People and New Gods at issue 11. Forever People, we saw an end of their story, but the way it ended, and I understand this is DC editorial's fault. They should have let Kirby finish the story the way he wanted to finish it. You let him go for almost a year on these stories. Why not just let him play it out? Why not? They say sometimes celebrities are more famous after they're dead. Well, maybe that could happen with Fourth World. If you hadn't focused on the sales, maybe you could let Kirby finish out the story. And then once it's done, after it's done, your single issues didn't sell, but you could repackage it like DC's wisely done in the last few years. Repackage it into an omnibus or collected trade paperback series and sell those. And I think those would sell more than the single issues, in my opinion, because you'd have a contained, cohesive story, and that's the word of the day: cohesiveness. There's just no cohesiveness at all. It's just separate battles, separate adventures in each title, and none of it seems to really be. New Gods is the only line of story that's really carrying the main arc. Because as much as I love Mr. Miracle and Big Barda, it's just all about Mr. Miracle doing escape tricks. There were a couple issues where we talk about Mr. Miracle's origin, which I love. Again, I love the concept, the overall story of Fourth World. The issue where Mr. Miracle goes over his history, I love that. And where Big Barda goes over her history back on Apocalypse, how they were both imprisoned in the orphanage of Granny Goodness, and they were tortured and turned into killing machines, and how Scott Free escaped and came to Earth with Big Barda. And I love that part of Mr. Miracle, but outside of that, it's just Mr. Miracle doing stunts. Like his gimmick, his superpower is he's a master escape artist, and so most of Mr. Miracle is just an issue of him doing escape artist things to befuddle the agents of Apocalypse. But again, there's no cohesiveness. It's just a beginning to end story, and we're moving on. The only issue where it finally comes together, where we finally see direct interconnectivity, is in Mr. Miracle 18, the wedding of Barda and Scott. Highfather marries Barda and Scott. The forces of Apocalypse happen to be there. Granny Goodness and Vermin Wunderbar's there. That was a callback from issue 5. That was like one of the first callbacks I'd seen to an older issue. And, Orion, Lightray, and Metron are there. It's a happy celebration. And then at the end, Darkseid appears. But the wedding party got out of there in time to evade Darkseid. But there was no Superman in the Newsboy Legion. I don't know. I can't wrap my mind around this story enough. It's just so incomplete and so hard to follow. I guess what I'm trying to say, and why I'm having a little bit of a hard time talking about my experience. Now, I will say I'm glad DC gave Kirby the chance to wrap this up. They came out with a reprint series, New Gods, in the mid-'80s. I think right before Crisis on Infinite Earths, where they reprinted several issues from New Gods. And in the 6th issue, we finally get what this run, New Gods, has been trying to build up to. The prophesied fight between Orion and Darkseid. And that 6th issue of the reprint series is an all-new original story, and it bridges the gap between New Gods 11 and Mr. Miracle 18 to the graphic novel he will officially conclude Fourth World in, called Hunger Dogs, which was a fantastic graphic novel. I liked it. I didn't really like, excuse me, I didn't really appreciate that now they do say in the credits that they edited Kirby's art, but I personally just didn't like the fact that I could tell it had been tampered with. And there's that story, I posted it in my community tab. how on Superman's pals and Jimmy Olsen, we're just gonna say Jimmy Olsen, and Jimmy Olsen, they went back over Kirby's art on Superman's face. They wanted Superman to look like Golden Age Superman. But there's a whole video on that. I don't really want to go into that. But I just didn't appreciate in Hunger Dogs. I could tell Kirby's art had been tampered with. That's the ultimate disrespect, in my opinion, is editing someone's art. I don't know, when I think about my collection and what all I've read, I don't know where this story ranks among the all-time stories. Again, just in concept, I think it's one of the greatest concepts of all time. I love this story. I love the idea, not the story. I love the idea of Fourth World. I love the characters in Fourth World, but you know, for the 300th time in execution in a single issue, just so tough. You could read, the way this is written, you could actually read New Gods and not really miss anything. And maybe some people like that kind of storytelling where you could probably read Mr. Miracle and be fine, or you could probably just read Forever People and believe it to be its own story. You can read New Gods and believe it to be its own story size. Some people might like that. But for me, if I'm going to read books that are meant to be interconnected, I like to get the whole story. And it just didn't work out for me. And I understand a lot of this is DC's fault. Kirby did not get the chance to properly flesh out this story. Maybe it was all going somewhere, because it did seem to conclude in we did start to get interconnectivity in Mr. Miracle 18. It's just sad that Mr. Miracle 18 is the end of the original Kirby material. It does feel incomplete. Someone commented in my Fourth World halfway point check-in that Fourth World is the greatest incomplete story of all time. And I would have to agree. Well, that'll do it for me, guys. I hope I made sense in this video. I hope I didn't ramble on and on and on. I hope I was able to do like Neil Gaiman here, or Todd McFarlane or Grant Morrison, like I talked about. And hopefully my thoughts went somewhere, and I got the point across about how I feel about Fourth World and my journey. It's just so massive that it's just hard for me to kind of wrap my head around sometimes. And I don't mean massive in terms of scope. I just mean massive in terms of page count. But it's still got some massive elements to it. But that'll do me, guys. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and commenting. I need to go get a glass of water, something serious. And until next time.